Amina Rahman is a quiet tea seller in a crowded port city whose voice once filled the fields and alleyways with lullabies, songs stitched into the margins of her life, private and small. Rafael Moreno, a world-famous singer with a voice polished by studio lights and an ego honed in stadiums, arrives for a charity gala and, bored and cruel, forces Amina onto the stage to mock her. What follows is not humiliation but a rupture. Amina's unvarnished, untrained voice lays bare a truth that studios and spotlights have missed. The crowd's laughter curdles into stunned silence. The performance becomes a mirror that exposes Raphael's own loneliness and the unseen hunger beneath his applause. The story traces how this one raw, impossible moment reorders lives. Amina's quiet claim to dignity, Raphael's reckoning with pride and redemption, and the city's sudden recalibration of who gets to sing. Cinematic and intimate, the tale explores ambition, humiliation, dignity, and the strange grace that arrives when the world is asked to witness a human voice. The tea stall on the corner of Mirza Lane had no signboard, nothing to mark it on the city maps that tourists brought folded into their pockets. It was a scrape of plywood beneath a leaning awning, a chipped thermos warmed by coal, two mismatched stools, and the steady, small geometry of Amina Rahman's life. Morning after morning, she brewed smoky black tea, cut sweet lemon slices with a palm, weathered knife, and tied small paper cones of biscuits for the dockworkers who would, without ceremony, hand her the day in salaries and small jokes. Her voice belonged to that place. It belonged to the steam and the rain and the clink of spoons. She sang while she poured, a low, steady hum that bent into lullabies when the kids came by. No one had taught her to carry a tune on purpose. She had learned to sing in order to make waiting softer. The way salt softens bread. Her songs were private services offering consolation and a way to pass the hours so they might pass her more kindly. The city knew Rafael Moreno in a different register: billboards, late-night television slots, an slick charm that sold out stadiums. He was the kind of man whose voice had been engineered like a racehorse, bred and trained and fed by producers and PR. He arrived at the Mirza Lane Hall on a damp evening in a suit that cost more than the tea stall. The gala was a fundraiser for a new music school for children with promise. The posters said, with black and white photographs of serious-looking kids and dangling commas of hope. Amina had never been inside Mirza Lane Hall. She had, that day, closed early because the rain made the lanes slick with oil and she saved the last of her coal for tomorrow. She wandered without thinking, pulling the collar of her shawl around her face, and found herself near the hall as white limousines sighed into the drive. Curious, she listened to the bright, false murmur of people in dresses and suits the way one might listen to a stray radio station. Lena, who wrote for the city's culture column and still drank thick tea at Amina's stall when her deadlines allowed, spotted her and waved. "Come in, Amina," she called, her voice a clean thread amid the laughter. "There's soup." Amina almost refused. Gala nights were not for women like her. But the world had folded into something softer on that damp evening, and the instruments of hunger, curiosity, loneliness, had their own designs. She let Lena draw her through, a quiet figure in a patched coat among a crowd wearing stories. The stage was a ship, lights like portholes, a polished floor that reflected like water. Rafael performed in the center of that light, a grin practiced and hot, his voice a strip of caramel over the assembled applause. He moved as if he had been carved from applause and popularity. He made jokes about real talent and raw, local charm, and the audience laughed with him. They had paid to be amused. When the charity segment, for the people, came, Raphael took the mic with the casual cruelty of someone who had never had to fear an honest sound. "We want to celebrate our city's music, right? Real music, not just." He flung the word like a bone for dogs. "Manufactured celebrity. Right here, folks, we have a surprise. He smiled, predatory and gentlemanly all at once. The surprise was Amina, some man from the backstage. Someone who thought fame was a permission to play with lives. Had waved her forward. She stood in the wings, stunned at how her breath made a sound big enough to matter. Lena's hand squeezed her arm once, like a lifeline, and then she was moving into the light. The audience shifted like a sea. Murmurs. A few camera flashes. Raphael's smile widened in the way of someone who thinks he will finish a joke with a flourish. "You're on," Raphael said into the mic for everyone, including Amina, to hear. "Sing us something honest." The word honest brushed her, a funny, dangerous talisman, and the room laughed, soft and cruel. The kind of laughter that measures how far people are from one another. Amina felt the air close over her throat like a hand, then open when she remembered the rhythm of the tea stall, the clink of spoons, the lullabies she had mumbled into bowls. She had never meant to go on a stage as a performer. She had only meant to be small and useful and to make waiting gentler. Her voice, when she opened her mouth, came as if pushed by a tide. She began with nothing showy, no ornament, no effort to impress. She sang a song her mother had hummed while peeling onions, a tune trapped in the muscle memory of women who kept houses and hearts in equal measures. The first line was a thread, thin as a sigh. The room filled with it, and then the thread became a rope, because the sound was true and because truth has a kind of gravity that makes crowds quiet. It was not the polish of studio training. It had no deliberate vibrato, no glissando. It had cracks where the days had put them, small breaks like worn steps. But between those cracks the sound held enormous steadiness, like a rope stretched over a chasm. The melody bent under the weight of memory. The market's morning light, the dockworker's hands, the loneliness of pillowless nights. She sang in phrases that smelled of cumin and wet tar and laundry soap. She sang of a daughter who had left and of a father's name that wouldn't stick anymore, of small economies of survival and the way hope arrives in teaspoons. Words that had never seemed lyrical now opened like secret doors. For a few beats the laughter died. For a few beats Raphael's smile froze, as if his face had been poured into a mold, and then forgotten. It is a strange thing to hear a voice that has not learned the language of applause. It arrives tidy and centerless and refuses to preen. The sound pushed through the hall and the world. A room constructed of mirrors and performances unmasked itself. Then something more dangerous happened. The audience listened. Not politely. Not in the distracted way like fingers scrolling through a phone. They listened like people who have been waiting for permission to remember they are also made of small loves and animal fears. Men with children on their shoulders lowered them. Women who had come to be seen softened at the lids. Journalists pulled their pens and did not write at once. Lena sat with a hand to her mouth, the habit of the critic evaporating in the face of what she heard. Raphael's expression changed with the weather. At first his eyes slid toward the cameras. Control, then narrowed. Annoyance, then something like panic. He had built a career on the majestic ease of consumption. You buy his records, you buy his smile. Here was a voice uncommodified, not for sale in parts. It said nothing about contracts, and that made it dangerous. When Amina finished, the hall held its breath for the measure of a heartbeat, and then erupted. The applause started as shock and then became something vast and complicated. Some clapped in disbelief. Some cried. A man in the third row stood and wept openly, his hands trembling. Children stared as if they had watched a small miracle. Someone shouted, "Again!" And someone else, more unsure, whispered, "Who is she?" Raphael looked like a conjurer whose rabbit had bitten him. His laugh, when it came, was brittle. He cleared his throat and scolded the audience for being sentimental, called the moment a fluke, offered to teach her how to place a note. He tried to make jokes again, to reframe the night as his. But the night had moved. The song had doffed its cap to everyone in the room and asked nothing. Raphael's jokes were thin air. In the small swirl that followed, a flurry of phone numbers pressed into hands, of people wanting to know the story. Amina returned to her shawl and the slow gravity of her ordinary bones. Her hands trembled like little birds. She had not intended to be heroic. People spoke to her with the heavy sincerity of those who have been dislodged from their comfortable arrogance. Lena steered her out through the back, murmuring things that sounded like congratulations and offers and dangerous promises all at once. The next morning, Mirza Lane was a different world. The vendors clustered to listen to the radio, and every 2 minutes someone would say the names Raphael and Amina like they were spells. People crowded the stall for tea, not because they wanted the tea, but because they wanted to stand near the woman whose voice had been louder than a stadium. Children clung to her skirts. A dock worker pressed a wad of bills into her hand without looking. The city seemed to have rearranged its scale, but the world refuses to stop. There was, threaded through the kindness and the curiosity, something else, a chorus of offers. Producer numbers scribbled on scraps. Invitations to audition rooms that smelled like lemon, scented sanitizer and ambition. Managers with teeth like small daggers. They wanted her voice to be famous. On vinyl, on primetime, in the mechanical hunger of the industry. The word brand grazed the air like a fly. Amina was not sure what she wanted. Fame was a language she had never learned. At night she lay awake and the song returned like a tide. She tried to imagine herself filmed, remade, image, smooth, and in the picture she looked small and strange, diminished by lights that did not match her. She had seen Raphael on television and noted, with a woman's bluntness, that his voice on a studio record and his face had been separated from the small rote things. He said in interviews, if she were to go into that world, would her songs be polished like fruit, stripped of their skins, packaged? Lena argued for it. They'll give you a studio, Amina. Vocal coaches. Money. You can teach your daughter. If she wants to come back, you can fix the roof. Lena's words were urgent, with the critic's habit of measuring cost and meaning. Her career made her a broker of possibilities. She could see what momentum might turn into. Raphael, in the meantime, took a different tack. There was a story in the press about a famous singer, humbling himself by finding a local star. Raphael was photographed with Amina, his arm around her shoulders, his smile apologetic and careful. He said, in those interviews that are always a kind of confession, talent is everywhere. We should celebrate it. He sounded rehabilitated. The cameras loved him for it. But his eyes were always slightly too quick when they looked at Amina, the way a man tracks a rival. He texted to say he was arranging for a live television appearance where they would sing together. To raise more funds for the school. Amina read the text and felt the old kitchen nod of mistrust. She thought of the way he had stood under the lights that had turned him into an idea, and then made her a joke to be unpicked and shown. Yet the city hummed around her with possibility. Her daughter's name, Santa, returned to her like a bell. She imagined a life where Santa could wear shoes that were not hand, measured in market stalls, where there would be a cupboard with no holes. The night of the televised duet, the studio felt like a cathedral. Cameras rolled silently like great black beetles. Raphael was polished into propriety, his smile glinting. Amina arrived with hands that had been scrubbed and nails that spoke of care, not attention to glamour. She thought about the lesson of the tea, Stolf. People come back for a particular taste and will notice if you change a pinch of salt. She wanted not to be an ornament. She wanted to sing like the woman who had given lullabies to old men on rainy mornings. They were introduced with the theatricality of someone presenting a neat narrative arc. The famous singer refurbishes the life of the local found talent. Donations bloom. The cameras harvest the sentiment. But Amina had not come to be harvested. She had come because the gift of that first performance had cleaved something open in her chest that could not be stitched down again. When the duet began, Raphael offered the opening lines with his practiced grandeur. He tried to mold the song into a grander scale, the kind of arrangement that fluffs a voice so it can be carried across an arena. Amina listened. The band, used to his tempo and his cues, swelled exactly when he expected. He smoothed his face into a reverent look, the look of those who have owned the stage. Then Amina took the second verse and changed the song. Not the lyrics, only the way the syllables fell. She softened them at the edges, drew in the vowels until they became small, shining beads. Her voice dipped into the spaces where Raphael's voice had always filled too quickly. People in the studio felt something like a soft rearrangement of furniture inside their chests. The song was suddenly a conversation rather than a solo. Raphael flinched. He tried to pull the song back toward himself, to claim its arc. But the audience, live and invisible, had seen the moment of the T stall as if it were a hinge. They had learned something about Amina. She did not require adornment to be heard. The duet was no longer a platform for Raphael to show charity. It became, instead, a place where his thinness might be exposed. Halfway through the song, in a flash that felt like the instant of a camera shutter, Raphael stopped singing. Not because he was unable, but because he had encountered something he had not planned for: a mirror. He heard, in Amina's voice, the things he had traded: home, small truths, the way a person stands with their back to the wind, because they have to. That halt was a loss of control, a small nakedness he had never allowed himself. The cameras blinked. For the first time in his life, Raphael's breath made a sound on the track that had not been engineered away. He muttered, pulled at the edge of his jacket, and then, slowly, almost shamefully, left the stage. The studio audience was stunned. The producers fumbled. The music trailed off. Social media erupted into 100 small crises. Some called it a stunt, some a collapse, and others, more simply, a rupture. Interviews followed. Raphael retreated into a kind of silence. He issued an apology for his earlier ribald behavior at the gala, and then, in the months that followed, he stepped back from the public, dazzling like a man who had been burned and no longer wanted to invite the press to inspect the scar. Amina, in the wake of that televised duet, had to make decisions. Men with contracts and lawyers came with offers that smelled like honey. They promised fame and money and a reimagined life. "We can make you a star," they said, eyes on the ledger and not on the woman who had sang. They wanted her voice compressed into tracks and shaped for Spotify playlists, not for the market lanes. They wanted to teach her to hold the note longer, to place the consonants right, to sell a version of herself. She thought of her mother, the small, fierce woman who had humored the heavens into offering bread, and of the tea stall where the world had been measured in cups. The music industry proposed that she take her smallness and fold it into something large and uniform. It offered the choice every person with a sudden reputation must make: he to become an object of commerce, or to protect the private and fragile thing that had been seen. She chose something in between. Amina refused the first offers. She did sign with a small collective of musicians from the city who had little capital and a lot of curiosity. They set up rooms in a school auditorium and taught each other the democratic language of musicians who had not been baptized in the studio sheen. They recorded her songs in arrangements that allowed for the small pauses and breaths that had become part of her voice. The recordings were imperfect. Tape hiss, a table cough. But they were honest. They found an audience, small at first, then larger, the kind of audience that travels by word of mouth and returns for the exact remedy they find there. Raphael, in his retreat, He read writers who spoke of humility not as a cloak but as a muscle to be exercised. He listened to Amina's recordings at odd hours, hands in his pockets, face a map of old decisions. He felt something loosen in him, a wire that had been strung tight by the industry's rhythms. Pride, he recognized, had been a curtain through which he had watched himself. Amina had pulled it aside. One winter afternoon, he walked to Mirza Lane, not to the hall or the studio, but to the tea stall. He stood a little awkwardly, croaked some apology rehearsed thinly in his throat. The men at the stall nudged each other, never having seen the famous man so uncertain. Amina poured him a cup as if pouring water for any man who had come in off the rain. She did not pretend the past had not happened. She said, simply, "You wanted me to sing. You made a show of me." He put the cup down. "I did," he said. "I was cruel. You were trying to be clever in a room that wasn't yours," she said, and there was no triumph in her voice, only the directness of someone who had nothing to prove and all the care to give. Raphael took the space. He sat, a little outside the orbit of those who had known him only as an idea. He told her of the emptiness behind applause, of the days when no one would call and he would stand at the window and count his songs like coins. He spoke of how easy it had been to mistake quantity of noise for weight of meaning. They did not become friends in the sense that city tabloids loved to claim. There was no sweeping mentorship, no ad-laden partnership, yet something shifted. Raphael offered to help in small, practical ways. He paid to fix the roof of the school where the small collective recorded, anonymously at first, then in a letter where he explained that it had been Amina's voice that made him understand that the music school needed not only fancy POs but a place warm enough for students to practice through winter. The city, which had learned to gossip with the veracity of a tide, speculated on many narratives. Some said Raphael had found a new incarnation, others that Amina had catapulted herself to a place of strategic humility. But news would always be impatient. The truth was softer and stranger. An ordinary woman had been given a stage and used it to call back what the city had forgotten to listen for. A famous man had been unmade of a little and then remade by it. He recognized his own smallness, and in doing so, he stopped pretending that spectacle was the only form of truth. Santa came one day to Mirza Lane with a childlike bundle of fragile, first-time pride, her hair braided, shoes scuffed, eyes bright. She stood at a safe distance, not wanting to break the frame of their cautious reunion. Amina had begged her to return to visit, not to come back into any contract or expectation. But because the tea stall had always been a place to sit and breathe, when mother and daughter walked out together that afternoon, hand in hand, they were photographed by someone who had been there since the gala. Someone who had seen how a room could refashion itself. The photograph did not become a billboard. It became a small image on a local paper. The headline read, "A voice to keep us quiet." People read it and, for a few hours, sat quietly in their homes, thinking about the lives that hum under the city's louder parts. Amina continued to sing in the tea stall. Sometimes she performed on small stages with the collective, earning honest money and 100 true listeners. She taught a child with a shy voice how to shape a vowel like a little offering, and she laughed when the child discovered that music is less about reaching the note than about deciding to reach honestly. Raphael returned to the stage eventually, but his songs had changed as if someone had taught him to listen in the middle of his phrasing. He performed in smaller venues at first, where the distance between singer and listener was not measured in seat numbers, but in the eye's circle. He sent a letter to a national music magazine about humility, short, awkward, and startlingly sincere, and they published it with a photograph of Mirza Lane Hall before dawn, its windows like tired eyes. The city did not remake itself overnight. There were still gilded studios and awards and people who chased popularity like migratory birds. But a fissure had opened, And in that Fisher knew things sprouted small venues that favored patience, radio shows that played voices without perfect compression, and producers who looked for texture rather than only sheen. At the end of the first year, Mirza Lane had a small plaque fixed to a lamppost outside Amina's stall. It read nothing more than, "Hair, a voice remembered us." People stopped to read it and sometimes left coins by the base of the post, small offerings from hands that had been made generous by remembering their own quiet marvels. On certain evenings, Raphael would come down from his apartment and sit at the back of the stall, like a man visiting a church rather than trying to own one. He would pay for his tea without cameras and listen. Sometimes they'd talk in the low, honest intervals that the world makes for those who have been altered by an accident of truth. They spoke of small practical things, roofs, the price of coal, and of the dangerous business of learning to be humane in public. Amina never wanted to be famous for fame's sake. She wanted her daughter to have options and her neighbors to be able to sing without cost equations in their heads. She wanted a small dignity, like a thread that could be stitched through the everyday. The world had offered her 1,000 mirrors, and she had chosen, in the end, to hang only a few. On the anniversary of the gala, the Mirza Lane Hall invited her to sing, not as a stunt, but as a guest at the school's small recital. She accepted. The hall was smaller than before, less polished, and full of children with voices like tentative lamps. Amina walked on and did not speak. She sang a lullaby she had learned as a child, unamplified, and the sound spread like a soft weather over the audience. Raphael sat in the middle row, not on a throne but on a bench like anyone else, hands folded, listening. When she finished, there was no roar, only a collective inhalation and a long exhale. No one tried to make it a spectacle. No one tried to package it. They applauded because they had been moved, plain and complicated as that. A woman in the front row stood and said, simply, "Thank you." The words were small and true. Amina smiled as the room shivered with the small weight of being recognized. She stepped down from the stage and, as always, returned to the street that held her. The tea stall waited there like a constant that a mathematician might call inevitable. She brewed the tea and cut lemons, and as the city went about its mercies and indifferent cruelties, people passed by in their small and large dramas. Once, late at night, when she closed the stall and folded herself into the narrow seam of her life, she would sometimes hum the chorus that had shocked a crowd, and then let it become something softer, a private harbor. The song had done what songs do bestie. It had opened a place where people could find each other. The world had shifted by a few inches, a small revolution of attention. And Raphael, well, he learned a new kind of stagecraft. He learned that silence can be more dangerous than noise and humility more durable than applause. He continued to sing, but not to silence the world any longer, only to add a voice that might, on some nights, be the echo of someone who had once been forced to stand in the light and, against all expectation, had taught everyone how to listen.